Welcome to Red Gauge. We're going to continue our series on fundamental training principles. Delighted to be joined again by Dr. Tim Suchomel, and today we're going to talk about reversibility and why you should be thinking about it and why it's important. It is kind of a funny topic to talk about because so much of what we're doing is about moving forward, and this is kind of the time where you have to take a moment to think about, what is it that you're juggling when you're always moving forward. So, could you tell us a little bit about what reversibility is?
Yeah, so good to be back and continuing on with the series. Always lots to talk about when it comes
Uh,
to these training principles, no doubt. So reversibility is just based on the root word is we are reversing something. So essentially we are deteriorating or losing a previously gained fitness characteristic. So if we think about having gained strength or gained speed and then losing it after not training with it or having a down period of recovery or something along those lines. But yeah, basically we're losing something that we previously gained, and this can be due to involution from monotonous training where we're not changing things up enough. I know our previous conversation we were talking about variation and not being able to provide enough variation, which may cause monotonous training. But
Mhm.
another aspect may actually be poor fatigue management. So lots of different things to talk about here, but yeah, in essence, it is the loss of a fitness characteristic that we previously had.
Yeah. And it's something that we never want to admit, but once we get past that first, 6 months to year of training, we start to have to make value judgments, right? Like it's nice to be early because you can usually get better at everything when you're brand new. But once you make it past the point of being brand new, there's nobody who's ever figured out how to, run a 2:10 marathon and show up at the Mr. Olympia. So, we have to make our choices about what our focuses are, and that kind of by definition means that we have to be paying attention to what we aren't working on,
Right.
like to some extent.
Right. I mean, it's what do you need and when. Ideally, we're able to peak all of our fitness characteristics. Our strength, power, speed, endurance, all those things, whatever we would need to be successful, all at the exact same time. The problem is a lot of those characteristics are not compatible with each other. So
Hmm.
it's all about pairing those the compatible characteristics. And don't get me wrong, a lot of them do relate to each other, but it's very difficult when you get those sports that require aspects of maximal strength as well as a lot of cardiorespiratory endurance. Because if you think about both ends of that strength endurance continuum, it's very difficult to be able to peak both of those at the exact same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's even like you can make an argument that there's some really difficult peaking things in spaces that seem like they should be easier. So like if you think about strongman events where they may be doing reps in a minute and then something else is a max effort, both of those systems are different to train and different to peak, so they can be pretty challenging.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the main thing is, the detraining aspect of it is, if we remove something or if we reduce a certain training stimulus, it's very likely that we're going to, experience a reversibility effect. Now, as you mentioned, the training status of the individual is going to, mitigate and or modify the extent to which we lose that fitness characteristic, because it's not just going to be a one size fits all, as nothing is when it comes to our athletes, but um, you know there's certain fitness characteristics that last or can hang on for a longer period of time, but it's also provided of how you gain that fitness characteristic as well. So if before we get to the reversibility piece of it, it's more about how do you plan your training out so that you gain a specific fitness characteristic, and how do you gain that fitness characteristic. So if we plan things out over a long period of time, long-term training, we have a tendency to hang on to that fitness characteristic for a longer period of time. Versus if we are trying to, peak a characteristic within a short period of time, we're probably not going to be able to hang on to that peak for a really long period of time either. The reality is that we cannot hang on to our peak performances for long periods of time anyway. You
Mm-hmm.
know, based on our previous conversation, it's I've talked with certain sport coaches, football mainly, and I'll ask them the question, do your athletes need to be powerful? Yes. When do they need to be powerful? And their comment would be all the time, and the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that's not realistic. So we can't be at our peak performance all the time, but we can modify our training to peak at specific periods of time while maintaining certain characteristics to a greater extent. So again, I mentioned the fact that it has to do with um, how we introduce a stimulus and expect to get certain training effects. So if we introduce a strength endurance stimulus where, our 3 sets of 10, for example, it's
Mm-hmm.
very reasonable to expect that someone who is more well trained will likely experience a decrease in their rate of force development
Mm-hmm.
just due to the volume of training that they're doing. And they're also not training speed at that point. It's work capacity and potentially muscle size depending on the stimulus that we have. Now, I mentioned that is in a trained individual because a novice, if you were to introduce something like that, everything improves.
Yeah.
Everything goes up. I like to think of strength endurance stimuli, or excuse me, endurance and strength, high volume and strength are like a middle school relationship. You
Mm-hmm.
know, when they get together at first, it's great. They're holding the hands. It's all well and good. But as soon as they start to mature, they go their separate ways. So the idea is that when it comes to reversibility, you're looking at what stimuli are you introducing and what is going to hang on from the stimuli that you are introducing.
Yeah, so there's kind of then phases to it, right? So the reversibility when you're first starting out is really just, am I training or not training? So like if you're not training, you'll experience losses in capacity because you just aren't doing anything, and the body is parsimonious, right? It's cheap. Um, and then as you get past that, you'll experience that reversibility whenever your training structure changes. So you pick the thing that you want to push forward, and other things will decline a little bit. But we do know that if we have been training something for longer, it's more resilient. If we've been training it for shorter, it's less resilient. So hopefully by the time you get to the point where you have to choose those emphases, you've got enough fitness base that it won't just disappear all the way on you.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that there are specific fitness characteristics that certainly last longer just in
Hmm.
general. So our maximal strength hangs on for a long period of time.
Hmm.
Our cardiorespiratory endurance hangs on for a long period of time. But things like our speed, power, rate of force development, those what we would consider our explosive characteristics, those are the first things to go.
Yeah.
Anything speed related is usually the first thing to go, or anything, you know, super neural. I'll say like those really
The
ballistic characteristics.
yeah, and the technical characteristics, right?
Oh
So
yeah,
like if you're a weightlifter and you go 2 or 3 weeks without lifting weight, so you'll experience some pretty significant technical regression.
yeah. It's
Likely.
interesting. I think it is all based on, again, how long has someone doing it. So in your
Hmm.
example, when it comes to the weightlifters, if you have someone who's a novice where they get introduced to the full lifts and they've been doing them for a couple months and everything, and then you remove that training altogether and they come back and it's like a baby deer all over
Uh-huh.
again. But
Yeah.
at the same time, if you have someone who's been doing this for years and years and years, I mean, we'll use Lu Xiaojin as an
Uh-huh.
example. He's not competing anymore, but if I ask him to do a clean and jerk, I'm sure he's perfectly capable of doing it.
Yeah, yeah, it's still gonna look good. Who was the Russian guy who retired from weightlifting a few years ago? I can't remember his name now.
Klokov?
Yeah, Klokov.
Yeah.
Klokov would, it seemed like to the outside, maybe he wasn't taking long breaks, but it seemed like they were kind of long breaks from weightlifting specifically. And then he'd go back and do something and do some monstrous effort. And it was like, where'd that come from?
Yeah, I wish I could pause snatch 190 kilos.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. So, you mentioned a relationship between reversibility and fatigue. So, like, once we kind of get the basic idea of like, if you are training, like maybe it's the off season and you're training really hard for kind of metabolic improvements, and then as the season comes in, maybe you're doing more power and strength work, and kind of slowly those glycolytic channels or whatever might be like losing some productivity, but you'll see increases in strength and speed as you focus on those, which might be more important for the actual performance. What is the relationship with reversibility and then just our fatigue management? How do we dovetail those two together?
No, I think they're kind of one and the same. It's not, our reversibility is not, one in one necessarily with
Mhm.
fatigue management, but it's definitely related. If we're not managing our fatigue, then we're not going to be able to maintain our fitness characteristics as well. But also the poor fatigue management aspects of it may actually reduce the adaptations that we could actually be getting in the long run anyway. So
Mhm.
so the example that I can use is, if we are constantly training to failure, where you know, training to failure is fatiguing, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that, regardless of the volume that you're performing. If you do it consistently enough, you're going to fatigue the individual. So as a result of that, we may not actually be achieving the actual adaptation that we could be getting, and as a
Mhm.
result, we kind of hit that non-functional overreaching stimulus that we get, and then we eventually start to overtrain, and that's where we start to get those effects, where we start to see decreases in performances that can actually last a long period of time.
So our reversible or non-reversible window is kind of bound on either end by too little or too much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the art of programming is it's going to obviously be something we talk about when it comes to individualization, but the art of programming is really finding the what, but the what to justify the how. So if we are going to improve something, how are we going to do it? And once we figure out how we're going to do it, what are we going to use?
Hmm.
And tailor that to the individual. Not to transition us to individualization, because I know we're going to go there, but yeah, the type of training stimulus that someone needs or to for a specific fitness characteristic, or at least to maintain that fitness characteristic, is so variable.
Hmm.
The what an individual can tolerate in terms of training volume compared to others. And we also have to consider the fact that more experienced individuals require a larger volume of training to actually modify something, because they've been at a certain level for so long that we're
Hmm.
chasing fractions of a percentage in terms of an improvement. So, if you think about our 100-meter sprinters, we're chasing, hundredths and tenths of seconds to be able to be faster than where we were. Because it's not like you just magically, flip a switch
Hmm.
and say, "Oh, I just ran half a second faster."
Hmm. Yeah, my oldest son just started working out with me. He just asked if he could come lift weights, and he's about 4 workouts in, and his first time doing like a dumbbell bench press was like 15-pound dumbbells, and then his second time was like 20. And you're like, okay, well that's a 33% increase. If you could do 33% every single time, right? Whereas
That'd
you
be
know,
great.
uh yeah, right. But like my buddy Logan was 1,000-pound squatter, and so he adds 5 pounds. That's a 5%, or not 5%. That's a 0.5%
Right.
increase, right? And so the magnitude of change is definitely smaller as you're more advanced, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we're taught initial programming, like percentages of 1 RM, for example, they'll say, "Yeah, you just go up 5% every single week." I was like, "Do you know how much that actually is? Like, that's really significant."
Uh-huh.
For the average individual, if you take someone who squats 100 pounds versus someone who squats 300 pounds,
Hmm.
okay, you go up 5 pounds per week. It doesn't seem like that ridiculous. Like, it's possible, but it's not that ridiculous. Versus your 300-pound squatter. Now you're talking about 15 pounds a week,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which
and
they'd have to be pretty talented to maintain that for any period of time.
yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
so you know my students may not like it, but when I'm talking about, yeah, we're probably going up 2.5% per week. And they're like, well, we like whole numbers. And I was like, well, that's a problem because, like, you can do 2%, you can do 3% if you really don't like your 2.5%. But at the same time, the numbers are probably going to make a lot more sense doing 2.5% versus 2 or
Hmm.
3%.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It is funny how often it's uncomfortable to do the right thing. Like so often in your training, you're gonna want to like stick with things that you like, that you have worked for you in the past, that are convenient to do, and so often that's not going to be the best move, and oftentimes it'll leave people stagnant for extremely long periods of time, you know.
Yeah, if it were I tell my students this all the time. It's if if everything worked for everyone all the time, every training program would be exactly the same.
Uh-huh.
It,
Yeah.
it you know it would be exactly the same. Everyone would be doing the same exercise, the same sets and reps, the same intensities, and nothing would be unique.
Hmm.
But it doesn't work that way. So,
Yeah.
and we're talking about all these different training principles. One overload is going to be different for one person than another person, and the amount of variation that someone needs from week to week, block to block is going to be unique, but also the specificity of it. How
Hmm.
specific do you really have to be with certain things? We kind of talked about the most common movement in sports is the triple extension movement of the hips, knees, and ankles. It's
Right.
like, how many different ways can you train ballistic triple extension? Like, I can do a plyo, I can do a jump, I can do a loaded jump, I can do, a
Yeah.
weightlifting movement, I can do a squat. And there's like all these different things that I can do that all train the same thing.
Hmm.
So when it comes back to sports and it's or different sports rather, a lot of the programs end up being very similar, except for like that last 10 to 15% of the program.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of like, physiological mechanisms that we don't really need to spend the time getting into because I don't know how valuable it is. I mean, maybe we'll talk about it at one point, but um we can't just go up forever on everything, right? Like we just don't get it. So then we got to start making the value judgments. So when we are looking about it through the lens of reversibility, we could kind of do like maybe a year's training. So we'll start with like our postseason or off season and run through. What are the trade-offs that we should be making in terms of reversibility? Like when we're in that off-season window, we know that all of the work we do in our off-season window isn't going to end up, still being there necessarily in our championship season. So, or section, right? So, like, what are the things that we can focus on early that we know that we're going to trade, and then, you know, I guess what are the ways that we want to consciously implement it, and then the ways that we want to take advantage of it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when we get down to championship season, regardless of the type of competition, generally speaking, you're going to be at a really low. If you're in a good training program,
Hmm.
you're going to have a relatively low training volume overall. We're going to peak. It's going to be very short. Like weight room sessions are going to be very short. But as a result of that, your work capacity at that point is really low.
Yeah.
It becomes really low, especially when you consider the fact that we're trying to gain that last bit in a peaking phase where we're not going to be able to maintain that for a long period of time. Because it's kind of funny when you think about if you were in a powerlifting competition or weightlifting or something like that, where you go and compete, and then the following week you go back to train, and you just feel terrible.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's actually like a real problem for a
Oh,
lot of
it's
athletes.
absolutely. So,
Yeah.
but you have to consider like where you just came from. You
Hmm.
did all of this for one specific peak, and then you're going to hopefully take a little time away from doing that activity so you can recover a little bit because especially over like a long season, baseball, soccer, what have you, it wears on you, and the small nicks and bruises and everything that's gonna factor into that is just gonna accumulate over the year. But the first thing that I usually tell my athletes when we're coming back is we're going to get back to the basics of moving well. So
Hmm.
we're talking about reestablishing technique. I call it a return to fitness phase,
Hmm.
where before we do anything in terms of higher intensity, in terms of higher volume or anything, we're picking something generally right in the middle. I usually use like a 3 sets of 5, but the weight that we're using is usually something that's anywhere between probably 50 to 65% of what their 1 RM is. So it's basically like something that they could do for 10 to 15 reps. But
Yeah.
I just want them to move with a very low amount of weight and, full range of motion. Let's start to move or start to reestablish that motor pattern a little bit in these exercises, in these drills or whatever that we're going to be doing, before I would add any sort of volume to it. So that may last only, you know, upwards to 3 weeks, maybe even a full block for some people, depending on how beat down they actually were from the season.
Hmm.
Now, if we talk about a collegiate season, most of the time we get them through spring and then they go away. And then, and then Lord knows what they're doing over the summer. We hope they're doing the summer workouts that we give them. I usually assume that they don't do anything,
Hmm.
and then we get back, and we're in a return to fitness phase. But um, as soon as we start to get through that phase, and we reestablish movements, introduce basics and things like that, everything is non-ballistic. There is no speed component really to this. I will coach them to emphasize, finishing the lift fast. We always want to do that.
Yeah, effort is
Um,
important.
yeah, absolutely. But following that phase, now I'll start to introduce some volume with really low intensities. So, we may go to like a 3 sets of 10
Hmm.
after that with certain exercises. But depending on the length of time that I have, I may actually have individuals doing 4 sets of 5 with like a power exercise, like a pull from the floor or something like that, just to again develop some work capacity, but also at this point, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it anyway. Power endurance.
Hmm.
So what we're doing is we're starting to invest in power early,
Yeah.
so that we can start to reestablish those patterns, so that later on it will be essentially second nature when we start to use these exercises again.
And they'll have the work capacity to maintain the work when they get there. So
Correct.
you said something in there, and that there's just one step away from what you said is actually a really, I think, important takeaway for people to realize when they're talking about looking at other people's programs. So you mentioned having, this return to fitness block, and that might be something that an athlete is taking home with them when they're leaving their season, right? If they're a spring sport person, them coming home and they've got a return to season protocol, and it, is kind of looks a little bit like deload levels of volume and intensity, and then it will slowly ramp up.
Hmm.
One of the things that I've seen working at high school is that college kids will bring workouts home, and then other coaches will be like, "This is the workout we should be doing," and it's
Yeah,
important to take that into
this
that
is the
context,
way.
right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I just wanted to mention that whenever you're looking at somebody's programming, right, that it becomes descriptive, not prescriptive, right? Because you're looking at what somebody thought was appropriate for them, which, as you highlighted earlier, isn't always true for your group that you're working with, right? It might not always be appropriate.
Yeah,
And then the other thing that was like my takeaway there is that when we're looking at it through the reversibility lens, is that when we're a long ways away from our competitive season, we want to work on the physical fitness characteristics that are more persistent. So strength and size and metabolic capacity. And then we'll get more specific as the season goes. And those will kind of fall off a little, as we get closer to our competitive window, right? But they fall off slower, and there is a little we can do to maintain them, right? Like, I guess in the space of talking about reversibility, we should maybe talk a little bit about kind of like minimum effective doses.
sure. Yeah, I mean, it minimum effective dose is interesting because I've heard it. I've heard good things about it. I've heard bad things about it. But generally speaking, minimal effective dose is again, the smallest dose that you can give someone to elicit an adaptation.
Hmm.
So minimal effective dose, I can also think is how do I want to put this? Minimal effective dose is important because we want to elicit an adaptation, but we also need to establish what the individual can handle in terms of their maximal effective dose
Hmm.
without preventing overtraining.
Right.
So the idea of minimal effective dose is really important because we want to be able to establish what what can cause an adaptation,
Hmm.
but at the same exact time. Things like doing a single set of 6 to 12 repetitions between 70 to 85% perform to failure 2 to 3 times per week can allow an individual to hang on to specific strength characteristics.
Yeah. So
Um,
just slightly below a minimum effective dose might be a maintenance dose, right?
Right, a maintenance
We're just
dose.
hanging on.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, you know, so when it comes to the reversibility piece of it, if we are trying to maintain a characteristic, we still need to give them an effective dose to do that. But one of the things that what that ends up coming of this is we need to focus on the concentrated load aspect of it, of what we're giving them over the course of an entire training block rather than an individual week. So even if you were looking at it from a sprinting standpoint for maintenance, typically what has been out there is if we introduce maximal velocity once per week in season, we can maintain those characteristics.
Hmm.
I used to have my students who worked with our soccer teams. It'd be like, when are you going to program this over the course of the week? Because the reality is, how often are they actually going to do that during practice or
Hmm.
during a match? And the idea is that they may not, depending on what their position is. So, keepers aside, that's a whole nother ball game there.
Right.
Um, yeah, minimal effective dose. We need to be able to elicit an adaptation while also managing and monitoring for fatigue. Because again, with all of that in mind, if we're not eliciting an adaptation, are we really in the business of doing the best for the athlete?
Yeah. Yeah. And I was always surprised, I think, just in my own training, like for track and field for throwing stuff, right? The idea of trying to find a minimum effective dose, obviously, or not obviously, often wasn't as productive as I'd hoped it would be, or a maintenance dose. Like there was a lot of times where it was better just to drop that volume and focus on what I actually wanted out of my training block, kind of depending on the time frame. Like if
Mm,
it was obviously if you are hoping to maintain some level of fitness, like you're probably just going to have to do it if it's over a longer period of time. But um it's really interesting to think about, where exactly it is that you want to put those maintenance doses or those minimum effective doses, and where you want to spend time on the things that are the most important to you. And again, we'll talk about individualization in the next
yeah.
episode, because it can be very individual.
Yeah, 100%. I mean,
uh,
the minimal effective dose for each person is going to be based on their training status, training history, etc. Because, with a novice, we can give them anything. The joke that I say is, if you can get a freshman to walk near a weight room, not even go in, but go near a weight room 3 times per week, they'll probably get stronger because you
mhm.
gave them structure to actually go there 3 times per week.
Yeah. Okay, and so then the other space that we run into reversibility most commonly is when we do get to that peaking phase. So when you spend a lot of time building those traits of physical fitness, just kind of general physical fitness, right? The strength and the rate of force development and power and endurance and all that kind of stuff. And then when you really start fine tuning into your sport, those training volumes drop down, and the characteristics that you hope to build the most for your sport, which are frequently, the speed and power pieces, um, those will start climbing. But as those start climbing, our general fitness starts declining, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And so we can only do that for so long, right? Like you were talking about earlier, we can't be in peak shape forever. We can only we
that'd
can
be
only peak
nice.
for so
Yeah.
long, right? Yeah. So about how long, like if people are thinking about it and they're like, okay, well, I know that when I switch to my peak, I'm going to start losing fitness, right? How long should those peaks be? What is the window that we see in research for how long we can push on performance as our fitness is declining.
Generally speaking, peaking phases, and this is a lot of work by Inigo Mejica. He usually refers to peaking phases, or at least optimal peaking phases, being 8 to 14 days.
Okay.
Is usually that period of time. Now, part of that has to do with the fact with I think when we refer to peaking phases, we're not just talking about holding on to a peak for that period of time. We're talking about the build to peak performance. So, because again, the length of time that a characteristic can last after that, that's a different story. But 8 to 14 days is usually the length of optimal peaking, depending on the individual. That seems to be what the literature seems to support. Now, it also comes down to the type of peaking and tapering and everything that you are doing.
Hmm.
So we're talking about optimal lengths of tapers, but with are you using a step taper? Are you using an exponential taper? Because again, people are all going to respond differently to how they're going to be introduced to that.
Hmm.
If you and I were to use the same training program, and then we were going to we're going to peak for the same competition, is it truly going to be the same effect percentage wise and that we would jump our performance? The reality is it's probably not going to be.
Yeah, and even though we both like barbell sports and we spend a lot of time in the weight room and we're not novice athletes, it's still going to be probably pretty different.
Oh yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
again, training history, training status, the methods that someone is using is going to be very unique as well.
Hmm. So, um, and then, so we've got that 8 to 14 days for our actual peak. And a lot of times that looks extremely specialized where we're doing, just the activities that we want to measure or pretty close to it, right? And we're really trying to reduce fatigue and increase our specialization. Often leading up to the peak, we'll have a block of training where, like, let's say it's like powerlifting. So maybe we've had a long period of volume work to try to get bigger and everything, and then we'll have a shorter chunk where our volumes go down. It's not quite peak season where we're cutting out our volume, but it is like a transitional block where the focus becomes primarily on maximal strength, right? When
Hmm.
we switch to those focuses where we're no longer really concerned about like tissue development and more about performance, so we've got kind of a block of power work or speed work or maximal strength work, about how long can we sustain one of those blocks before we hit our peak?
I wish I could give you an exact length because
Hmm.
unfortunately it's going to be so variable. But
Yeah.
generally speaking, and we talked about this when it comes to variation,
Hmm.
if we are training for strength
Right.
specifically, as you mentioned, there is research to suggest that the length of a training block really focused on strength, where we will eventually need to introduce a new stimulus to modify something, probably is maxed out at about 6 weeks.
Yeah.
So, which is generally why most of our training blocks that we write for people are usually between 4 and 6 weeks.
Hmm.
But at the same exact time, individualization, how
Right.
someone responds to it, what training methods are they using, what are the volumes that we're using. It's so variable. And because again, if it worked the same for every single person, everyone would be doing the same thing.
And I know it's not like as much of a thing now. When I was young and I tried to do my first time where I was doing some periodization, and it was kind of like emphasis block periodization, where I do general stuff and then specific stuff. I looked back at what people were doing for those kinds of, like cumulative phases. So we're going to go through a whole strength and power block because I was a thrower, and then a peak. And they were often significantly longer than that. One of
Mm,
the things I didn't understand when I was younger is like the science is always improving, that's a true statement, but also um the um the usage, like whether or not you're using drugs or not.
hmm.
Like because it can stretch out your window a little bit if you're, in a sport that doesn't, care.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I we always have a unit, and we actually have one coming up here with my students on hypertrophy. And one of the things that they inevitably hear about is German volume training.
Uh-huh.
And I come back to them. You make that comment because because if I introduce that concept, they're like, oh, that's not that hard. I was like, really?
Hmm.
10 sets of 10, 75%. I was like, if you ever done that, have you ever
Yeah.
done one set of
Uh-huh.
10 with 75%? And if you say no, yeah, I mean, you like we're in for a world of hurt. But long story short, I had one student, and I'll never forget this. Um, he said he wanted to try it. Now his background is 400, 800, so he's got the gas tank
Uh-huh.
and the buffering capacity and everything to do this.
And just
So
for setup, just to contribute, like
yeah,
if I remember correctly, the 10 sets of 10 model had restricted rest periods, right? It wasn't open-ended. You weren't supposed to sit for 8 minutes in between sets. It was just like 2 minute rest periods or 90 seconds or a minute or
yeah,
something
I
like that.
think we gave him up to when we were doing this, and I'm sure maybe the German volume training method's a little bit different than what we did, but I think we gave him a maximum of 3 minutes.
Yeah. And so I know there was a constraint. I don't remember what it was,
Right.
but I'm pretty sure there was a constraint.
Yeah, because otherwise you'd be there forever.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
yeah, I mean you'd be like, yeah, I'm going to take 10 minutes. I'll come back and I'll do it all over again.
Uh,
But he gets through one, two, three. He gets through 9 sets, and he's still going. Like back squats,
mhm.
75%. He's still going. And I was like, he's got a shot. Like they're starting to get really slow at the end, but he can grind. So
Uh-huh.
he gets through 8 reps, and on the ninth rep of set 10, he failed.
Yeah.
And so at that point, obviously he was really disappointed because he put in all that effort just to come 2 reps short.
Hmm.
But going back to your point, when not to say that all the individuals who were doing this were on drugs, but it's possible.
Hmm.
Like the ability to be able to do certain things, and you look back at some of the Bulgarian training programs.
Hmm.
I mean, like you start to look at those numbers and you're like, there's no way.
Yeah.
And then it's
Yeah.
like, well, add a couple needles and maybe.
Uh, yeah, well, we had Max Ada on the show, and he talked about how when he went over and trained, he thought he would do everything, and then eventually he got to where he just couldn't even lift weights anymore, and he found out that they had a thing, Krushka, they called it, where
Mm,
it was like you would load less weight on the side the coach wasn't looking at. Like the athletes found ways to regulate, for the demand that was expected. So what showed up on paper and what was really done weren't exactly the same thing.
right, right.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Um, So we build our general fitness because as we get focused on sport, that's going to go away. And then we need to time bound how long we're going to be focusing on our sport training because it sounds like we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 weeks where we can really drive performance before we're going to start seeing real decrements in our fitness. And then we'll have to make a change again.
Right. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, generally speaking, like I talked about a return to fitness phase, and then we're going to start building some volume and everything. But then it becomes a roller coaster. We're going to
Uh-huh.
go down in volume, we're going to come back up. We're going to go down, we're going to come back up. But the way that we do it is very unique. So over the course of the training year, and I'm using an example of what I had done with my volleyball players previously, is that when they come back in the spring or they come back over winter break and we're going through a return to fitness phase and everything, we go through our return to fitness block, we start to introduce some volume, but then we're back to general strength characteristics
Mhm.
where our repetitions, generally speaking, were sets of 5, maybe upwards to sets of 6 depending on the exercise. But at the same time, we have laid the foundation for just general work capacity, and then we're focused on building that or using that to build other characteristics. But once we get towards the end of the semester, I need to make sure that I've at least laid the foundation for what I want them to do over summer break before they come back for a season. So we'll work into a general strength phase, but then we're going to work down into kind of what I would consider more your strength power or your strength speed strength phases where your repetitions are downwards to, doubles, maybe triples, in terms of their maximal strength capacity, and especially for our power-based exercises as well, because I want to at least give them a dose of that before they get off from school, and then they're going to go and hopefully do what I tell them to do. But at the same exact time, I also know that they're probably playing club or they're doing something. I saw this training program online. I want to do that, but
Yeah,
I
yeah.
also know that a lot of this is going to be modified based on the athletes that you have. I had D3 athletes at the time. I'm not writing the program for the pit volleyball players here. I know the person who is, and I know that they certainly have a plan all year round. That's probably followed a lot closer than what some of the ones that I wrote. Um, but with all that in mind, we're on a roller coaster because we may be down in low volume come May or around May, June, around that time. But at the same time, like, we still have months before the season starts. And I
Hmm.
can't stay in low volume the entire time. But what I can do is I can work them back up to a moderate to moderately high volume, but I don't necessarily have to revisit tens again. I might go to eights,
Yeah.
to build like a little more work capacity, but then a little bit more focused on the strength side of things. But yeah, then we start to work down in volume again and work up in intensity as the season gets closer.
Yeah, and there's a lot of evidence to like that reversibility thing doesn't just happen overnight. It's not like when you stop doing your, aerobic work that all of your aerobic conditioning is gone the next day, right? It takes time to decline. And we know that there's pretty big positive effects. So like if you were, a bodybuilder, there'd be a pretty big positive effect to occasionally doing a strength block or occasionally doing like a plyometric or ballistic block because it's going to help with characteristics that will continue to develop that thing, right? So you don't really have to be afraid of reversibility. It's not like it's something that we're trying to avoid. It's just something that we want to structure so that we know like how long can I be away from this before I come back? What can I put variety into to increase my next training block when I come back to it, right? So we can take advantage of the fact that it's a real phenomenon in terms of designing our programming so that we have phases that match our long-term goals, right?
Yeah, I mean, we hear the term surf the curve all the time, which has certain applications within strength and conditioning, but we're really riding the wave the entire time because
Hmm.
as volume may go up, intensity goes down, and vice versa. But you know, there's we can't stay doing the exact same thing all the time because we're eventually just going to get stagnant. And
Hmm.
this is where we talked about why reversibility can happen. Well, reversibility can happen if you don't give them a proper training stimulus, number one.
Hmm.
Number two, if we just introduce a monotonous training program where we just do the same thing over and over and over again, we may improve for a little while, but then eventually we're going to plateau and probably go the opposite direction. But we've been also talking about fatigue management because if we're not managing their fatigue with the training stimuli that we give them, they're not going to improve. Which is why we can't always just beat them down every single time they're in the weight room or during a training session, because training to failure is going to eventually create more fatigue.
Hmm.
More fatigue does not allow for the best adaptations to result.
Yeah. All right. Well, is there any like thing that we should be thinking about that we haven't covered? Did we miss anything important about reversibility?
I do think that it's important to mention. I think we kind of alluded to it a little bit. Is the type of training method that you're using, and there are obviously a spectrum. We also just can't put them in silos.
Yeah.
All the different types of training that an individual does. If you take your strength power athlete who's probably going to be doing, I shouldn't say probably, that may be doing your typical traditional strength based exercises, squat, presses, pulls.
Hmm.
But then they may be doing a weightlifting movement or derivative. They may be doing jump squats. They may be doing plyos, all these different things are going to contribute to fatigue a certain amount. So when it comes to managing that, it becomes really important that if you are introducing all these different things at once, even removing one of them can have a pretty significant impact on one, the training stimulus, but two, the amount of fatigue that results from the accumulative amount of training that you've been doing.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's not really like like in that example, right? Like there's not really like an interference effect between like plyometric or speed work and strength work, right? Like
No.
they kind of go pretty well together. But at the same time, if you're really getting to a point where you want to maximize either your force production, like rate of force production, or maximal strength, right? That little bit of fatigue that you're generating might keep you from pushing this up as far as it can go, right? So like by shrinking that little bit, you might still get some of the benefits of like, like let's say you shrink your plyometric bit, you might get some of the benefits still of the kind of the neurological effects of like your brain's ready to put in maximal effort that will help you with your strength work, but you can reduce that fatigue and get a little bit more out of your strength
Yeah,
work.
it all contributes to central fatigue.
Uh-huh.
You know, it's as much as we would love to just say, plyos are over here, weightlifting is here, strength exercises are here, speed work is over here. It all comes together into one. And,
Mhm.
if our individual athletes were robots, sure, go and add all of it in. You can do all of that, and it probably wouldn't be an issue. But because our athletes are not robots, we really have to take into account everything that they're doing.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, I think we covered it. I think we covered reversibility. So,
Absolutely.
if you guys got questions, comments, concerns, throw them in the comment section. I'll check out and see what we can do for you. Thanks so much for being here for this one. All right. Like, comment, subscribe, share. We appreciate the help.